It's October 19th, 2023, and this is Political Dharma with Alan Zundell. I have a guest on the show today, David Moskowitz. David has just published a new book, The Judge and the President, Stealing the 2020 Election, which covers the indictments of Donald Trump, both at the federal and state level, as well as a number of examples in his discussion of legal philosophy, essentially, which is questions about what is the law and how do we know what the law entails, which might seem to be straightforward to people in general, that you just look up somewhere what the law is. You see it in the Constitution, you see it on the statute books, but you are arguing that it's much more complicated than that, and you used the attempt of Donald Trump to substitute different electors in the electoral vote as an example of how complex law actually is. Do you think I fairly captured what this is about?
Yes, you have. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And I do want to say that what I know of your background is that you practiced law for about a half a century. I've been around half a century too. I don't know that I've had any particular career that long. I was a political scientist for a while. But anything else you want to say about yourself right now?
No. I mean, I'm still working, even though I've retired from practicing law.
Okay, so if people want to hire you as a solicitor, you're available.
No. I do entrepreneurial things.
Okay, yeah. I would also mention that your wife is mentioned in your book as serving as an elector in the Electoral College in 2020, which I found very fascinating, hearing those on-the-ground kind of descriptions of what it was like.
Yes.
So maybe we could get just started with the Electoral College, because people are interested in that. We have an upcoming presidential election. I've been making the case here on the show that I think no independent candidate or third-party candidate has a chance to win the presidency, mostly because of the Electoral College and the way it functions. But people don't know a lot about what the Electoral College is. For those who do know something, it seems rather simple. There's people who are chosen to vote for the president, and those people are chosen through a process of popular vote in the various states. You're saying it's not quite that clear in all cases. Am I right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And in fact, when you go into the voting booth, the electors, the people who are actually going to cast the vote, are not named, nor are you voting directly for the president. You're voting for unnamed electors, and in some cases, not even selected electors at that point.
Not even selected? In what sense do you mean that?
What I mean is that it's different in every state. The way the system works, every state can have its own rules, but in most states, the electors have been solicited to be electors, but they haven't been named as electors officially. You mentioned my wife, for instance. She didn't apply to be an elector. They contacted her, strangely enough. They said they had 2,000 applicants, but they wanted to pick some people who they especially thought would be good for that purpose. Would you be willing to serve? She said yes, but she wasn't formally appointed until August, after the primary election.
So when you say they selected her, by they, do you mean the campaign of a presidential candidate? Do you mean government officials, public officials?
No, the campaign for the presidential candidate.
I see.
They selected her, and then she didn't become official until after the election. Since Biden won the election in Pennsylvania, his slate of 20 electors were the ones who were then legally obligated and authorized to meet on December 14th and cast the vote.
And the role of Donald Trump in 2020 had to do with these alternative electors in the various states that would have been chosen by the other political party's candidate. Was Pennsylvania one of the states where that was a problem? Did they have alternative electors in Pennsylvania? I know it's a swing state, so I suspect it was.
Yes, Pennsylvania was one of the 7 states with alternate electors. At the time when the Electoral College met on December 14th, it wasn't publicly known that there were alternate electors meeting in these 7 battleground states. And in fact, my wife didn't know about it, and not many people did, with one small qualification. There was a reporter in Georgia, and he went to the Capitol to watch the official electors meet, and he walked by a conference room, and the door was open, and he walked in, curious to see what they were doing there. And they said, "Oh, we're just meeting to talk about some things." And then he kept going back and forth between the official meeting and that meeting, and he recognized who they were then, and he actually witnessed their proceeding. But except for him, he's the only one I know of who, and his was by accident, of course, other than the people who were planning the electoral alternate electors.
Let me back up a minute here. Just real basically, people may have the idea that the Electoral College is some kind of permanent institution because we think of a college as an institution of higher learning. But in this context, what college means is simply a group of people with a specific function. And so the function of the electors is to vote for the president and vice president. The key question is, who are those electors? How are they chosen? And you were just talking about alternative electors, but both parties, both major parties will have, in fact, the smaller parties will as well, they'll have electors ready in case they win in their state, so that those people can then be the people that go on to vote at the designated time and place.
Yes.
So
go ahead.
Go ahead.
The founding fathers not only, they specifically wanted these electors not to be a stable body that would meet every 4 years. The identity of the electors would change every 4 years. No one could be a permanent elector. And they specifically decided that the electors would each meet in their respective state capitals. So they wouldn't all get together, all 538 electors in the nation. They would all meet separately in 50 states and the District of Columbia. That was the original idea, and that's comes through to this day. So they all meet on the same day in their respective state capitals. So there's 51 meetings occurring, and they cast their votes. Now, the Constitution leaves it to the states to decide how the electors are selected. So it's not the same in every state. It's pursuant to state statute.
And you raised the question of faithless electors, that they're pretty common. People that are selected by a candidate's campaign to vote for the candidate, and that candidate wins in that state, but then they don't actually vote for that candidate. And it varies from state to state whether that how that's going to be dealt with.
Yes, and it's different in every state. There's a different system for what happens. In Pennsylvania, for instance, there is no prohibition upon an elector being a faithless elector. They cast the vote for who they think is best qualified to be the president. In other states, there's a different system. In Washington, which had 4 faithless electors in 2016, the system is that a faithless elector is fined $1,000. In some other states, the statute requires a pledge. So when you're appointed, you sign a pledge that you will vote for whoever won the popular vote. And then in some states, they go even further, that if you're going to be a faithless elector, the party that won the election can yank your appointment out and replace you. So it's different in some states. Well, some are the same, of course, but there's different patterns in each state.
And it would seem that there is potential there if there were a strong third candidate, like somebody stronger than Ross Perot in '92, for example, that there could be a lot of faithless electors that somehow decide that maybe this other candidate is more. That's a pretty far-flung scenario, but there's a lot of wiggle room within the way this thing functions.
There's a lot of wiggle room, and one of the tasks in writing this book that I was confronted with was I wanted to end up in a place where I had a legal theory that the faithless electors, if there were 270 of them, could not convert the outcome of the election. So I make a distinction in the book between customary rules, which do not have the force of law, and customary rules which have the force of law. We don't think in general terms about these customary rules, but they're very significant. For example, recently there's been discussion about whether a non-member of the House can become the Speaker. We have a customary rule that the Speaker has to be a member of the House, but it doesn't say that in the Constitution, nor is there any federal statute that commands that. So if you had so many faithless electors that you altered the outcome of the election, I think that there's a customary rule that the winner of the election must become the president.
And that might be determined by a judge somewhere or a set of judges, most likely Supreme Court.
Yeah, ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court. But my argument is that when the founding fathers said we're going to have an election, just like any contest, game, race, if I say to you, let's race to the front door, I don't have to say, by the way, the winner's the one who gets there first. That's understood. It's a presupposition. If we're having a contest, this is who the winner is. If we're having a race, if we're playing a game. Similarly, when the founding fathers said we're going to have a president who's elected, the presupposition is that the one who satisfies the criteria to be elected is the winner, and he should be the president. And I think that's a customary rule with the force of law. In contrast, the faithless elector is a customary rule without the force of law. And that's why faithless electors' votes are counted, because that's legal, which gets back to the question of what is the law.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me. The thing that throws people sometimes, though, is that when you're going to have an election, people assume the person who gets the most votes is the winner, but that's not necessarily the case in the presidential election. And that's because of the Electoral College and how the vote is determined state by state, more as a winner take all in each state system.
But it's not winner take all in all 50 states, by the way.
No, there's a couple of states where they split it up, and potentially other states could do as well. So this is a pretty flexible institution. Let's get into the Donald Trump issue. So there was the plot was that we'd have this other set of electors not only at the ready, but willing to sign certificates on the day that the electoral vote was held, saying that they were the true electors, and then to register that. Now, some people got in trouble, right? Some of these electors that followed through on this scheme got into legal trouble.
Yes, there have been some lawsuits filed against them. There are 7 battleground states. The document that they signed, the alternate elector signed, looks exactly like the document that the legal electors sign, with 2 qualifications. In 2 states, that's Pennsylvania and New Mexico, the alternate electors put a disclaimer in the certificate they signed. They said in those two states, this certificate will become effective only if the litigation challenging the fraud in the election is successful. The implication being that if the litigation was unsuccessful, and of course it was unsuccessful in every state, if the litigation is unsuccessful, then this certificate is not valid. So in those two states, the alternate electors did not commit a crime. In the other 5 states, they did, which is filing a false certificate. And they not only signed them, they mailed them or delivered them to the National Archives, to the local federal district court, and to the Congress.
Now, if I remember right, the difference in Pennsylvania or New Mexico or both was that they actually sought legal advice before signing these certificates.
Yes, and the lawyer in Pennsylvania for the Republican alternate electors insisted that they wouldn't sign it if they didn't receive an opinion letter from a national law firm that was familiar with Pennsylvania law, that issued an opinion letter that it was legal to sign it, that a Pennsylvania lawyer affirmed that it was accurate. So there had to be 2 opinions from two lawyers. When Cheesebro, who is the one who's going on trial starting tomorrow or Monday, the 20th or the 23rd, the Cheesebro, who was one of the authors of the alternate elector scheme, he responded to the Pennsylvania lawyer, this is a very dicey situation. The Pennsylvania lawyer took that to mean maybe it's not legal. Let's put the disclaimer in. And when the people who were circulating these false certificates saw that, they said to the Pennsylvania electors, well, don't tell anybody this is what you're doing. So in the other 5 states, they never did that. I don't know how New Mexico found out unless they decided on their own that there should be a disclaimer.
And on the other side, they were getting advice from lawyers affiliated with Donald Trump and his campaign that no, it was legitimate to sign these things and have them ready, and we wouldn't submit them, cross our fingers. We're not going to submit them unless we can prove there's fraud. And that's why these lawyers got in trouble. I think Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell, this where their legal troubles are focused? Is that they actually lied to these people or gave them bad legal advice?
Well, when Giuliani and Trump had a call to the Republican National Committee chairwoman to solicit her help in finding the alternate electors, and they told her that the certificates would be filed only if the litigation were successful in that state. And apparently, though I don't know exactly who it was, made the same representation to some of the alternate electors. And so they signed on a falsehood that was given to them. And in Georgia, the 16 alternate electors, of those, at least half of them have received immunity from having signed it on the basis that they testify that they were lied to.
And let's get further into the Trump indictments, because in Georgia, it was one of the indictments, and you discussed at length how complex the case there is. The other indictment was at the federal level. I remember you said you expected that to be a briefer trial, and the Georgia one might go on for quite a bit. You want to explain why there's 2 cases active and what's going on with each of them, at least insofar as you can simplify this for the audience?
Well, I'll try. So the Department of Justice trial, which will be in Washington, D.C., has only one defendant, and that's Trump. It has 6 unindicted, unnamed co-conspirators, and the journalists have identified 5 of them. And the 6th, and those 5, by the way, are all lawyers. It's Giuliani, Chesebro, Powell, Clark, and I'll think of who the 5th one it is at some point. Eastman is the 5th one. The 6th one is not identified as a lawyer, but is described as a campaign official. So the District of Justice case has only one defendant, and that'll be a shorter trial because of that. And it'll be focused specifically on Trump and what Trump did. The Georgia
what is he accused of doing exactly in that federal indictment? What was his significant crime?
In 4 counts, the obstruction of a public proceeding, which is the counting of the Electoral College votes on January 6th. The conspiracy, that's a crime in itself. The conspiracy to do that, the conspiracy that resulted in the riot, 3 of the, and the most interesting one comes out of a statute that was adopted back after the Civil War, when there were a series of efforts in the South where prospective former slaves registered to vote and were intimidated, pressured, killed in some cases. The Civil Rights Acts, which they called the Ku Klux Klan Acts, were adopted, and Trump is charged with conspiracy for violating that act. So that's another one of the conspiracy charges.
Okay, so going back to Georgia, then, this is a bigger case. It's a RICO case, racketeering case.
Yes. Now, Georgia is different in at least 2 major respects. One is that there are multiple defendants. In Georgia, 19, in the Department of Justice, 1. And the second is the RICO claim. There's actually 41 counts in the Georgia indictment, but the most important one is the RICO claim, count number 1, and all of the defendants, all 19, are charged with violating that statute. Now, RICO is originally a federal statute, so you can be accused of a federal RICO crime, but also many states have adopted a state version. The Georgia state version is broader than the federal one. For example, if you commit perjury, you can be charged with violating the Georgia RICO statute. And Sidney Powell, in fact, is charged with having committed perjury in front of the grand jury. And you probably know that today she entered a guilty plea.
No, I hadn't heard that. Just today.
Just today, and I predicted it in the book, strangely enough. I had said she would either plead guilty or be found guilty.
Well, the case against her was pretty strong, right?
The case against her was very strong because she met with Trump and Giuliani and some others who weren't identified, and she was appointed as special counsel to handle the voting machine, what shall I call them, inspections. And so she was appointed by Trump as special counsel to do that, and she signed the contract with the company that was going to actually do it. And in fact, there are loads of emails going back and forth with her and various co-conspirators to do that. So I said in the book, the case against her is very strong and fairly easy to prove because there were so many other people involved, such as Scott Hall, who was another of the 19 indicted co-conspirators who pled guilty last week. He was involved in the tampering in Coffee County, Georgia. So Sidney Powell, I thought, had no chance to get out of this. And the reason I thought that, by the way, is not so much how strong the case is, but because of the costs of defending the case. The people who appear on television to discuss the cases, who are very, very good, and they have lots of prosecutorial experience, and they discuss how strong the case is, but I've never heard any of them mention what the costs of defense are. The cost of defense for a RICO trial that's going to last 3-4 months and have 100+ witnesses has to be $500,000. That's an awfully big number to expect someone to pay who was likely to be guilty anyway, and who's going to spend 4 months without income going through the trial, stuck with this big legal bill, and is a likely candidate for having a jury verdict.
And that's not unusual.
The defense are a big factor, and that's going to start impacting other defendants in the trials that are forthcoming.
Yeah, I was going to insert that that's
affected Cheesebro yet.
That's not unusual for people to enter some kind of a plea to avoid the cost of litigation. In fact, it's much more common than cases actually going to trial.
Yes, especially if you have a clean record. Otherwise, in both of the
not
cases,
much money.
Yeah, in both cases of Hall and Powell, they have a clean record, so they're not going to jail, and they made a plea deal, and they'll both testify, and that gives you that, and then that's where the strength of the RICO trial lies. Because
and this portends. I'm sorry, interrupting, but this portends for Trump. Sidney Powell will probably be on the stand against him.
Yes, and she won't take the fifth. She's already pled guilty. As part of her plea deal, she's agreed to testify.
So she's in further trouble if she tries to refuse to testify.
Yes. No, she has to testify. That's part of the deal she made.
You willing to go out on a limb and say how any of this is going to influence the presidential election campaigns next year?
Well, that's another interesting issue, because in the Department of Justice, there is a memo that sitting presidents will not be prosecuted. So if Trump can delay this until the November election, and if he wins the election, he just has to get to Inauguration Day, and when that happens, the DOJ case gets put in the drawer. They won't proceed with it any further, based on the memo. That's the customary rule, if you like, in the Department of Justice. So Trump's strategy there is delay, delay, delay. That strategy doesn't work in the Georgia case because they don't have a similar customary rule. They will proceed with their trial.
So he would have to appear on the stand as acting president?
Yeah, well, he would take the fifth, so he might not actually testify, but they don't have to it's not a hiatus in the trial. Mm-hmm. They can continue with the trial, and he can be convicted. Now, I don't think he'll ever go to jail, even if convicted in Georgia or by the Department of Justice.
Is that again because of customary rules?
No, there's no customary rule because no president's ever been charged before. I just don't think it's practical.
Mhm.
A, he probably doesn't have a record. As far as I know, he doesn't. B, he has a right to have the Secret Service protect him, and they couldn't do that with him in a prison. So the mechanics, the logistics of it wouldn't work. I think the worst that would happen is house arrest, a fine, maybe probation.
So house arrest in the White House, possibly.
Well, wherever.
Yeah, it's a hard scenario to sketch out because it's so unprecedented. We're getting near to the end of our time. Is there anything important in your book? Well, there's lots of things important in your book that you weren't able to talk about today, but you want to say anything further about it to give people a sense of what you would like them to get out of this?
Well, I think that these two trials are trials of the century. They're enormously important. The Georgia one is more important for another reason. It's going to be televised. So it'll have the same impact as the Simpson trial or the televised hearings where Welsh called McCarthy out for his, this is going back to Senator McCarthy back to the 50s. I mean, it's hard to know what the televising of the trial will do, but I think it certainly will have an impact upon public knowledge, public awareness, and maybe then the system for electing the president will be amended by constitutional amendment, and we'll get a better system that is more certain and eliminates some of the hazards that exist in the present system, which you started off explaining.
I thank you for that optimistic assessment that maybe something good can come out of all this. And I would agree that we do need a clearer process for electing the presidents. Want to throw in one more thing to people to remember that these are not the only two indictments that Trump is dealing with. There's a host of others of various natures. And I do want to repeat that your book, The Judge and the President, Stealing the 2020 Election, is available. It's volume 3, actually, of a 4-part series discussing philosophy of law and various important cases. David Moskowitz, thank you very much. And we will look forward to that TV entertainment that you're predicting for us.
Thanks for having me.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We gained our focus, the moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on this vehicle Earth.